just days after investigators confirmed that the cockpit voice recorder, often called the black box, was recovered from the wreckage of the plane that killed NASCAR legend Greg Biffle. A new voice has entered the conversation, and this voice carries serious weight. Because it's not coming from a reporter, it's not coming from social media speculation, and it's not coming from someone guessing from the outside. It's coming from Mark Martin, a NASCAR icon, a longtime competitor of Greg Biffle, and a pilot with decades of experience flying the exact type of aircraft involved in this crash. And according to Mark Martin himself, the more he learns about what happened in Statesville, North Carolina, the more disturbing this crash becomes. Tonight, we're breaking down what investigators have confirmed, what remains unanswered, and why Mark Martin's comments are now forcing people to look at this tragedy very differently. Let's start with what has been confirmed. On December 18th, a Cessna Citation 550 crashed shortly after takeoff from Statesville Regional Airport in North Carolina. On board were Greg Biffle, 55, his wife, Christina, his 14-year-old daughter, his 5-year-old son, and 3 additional passengers. All 7 lives were lost. According to the National Transportation Safety Board, the aircraft was airborne for approximately 10 minutes before attempting to return to the airport for what investigators described as an emergency landing. There were no confirmed emergency radio calls, but one passenger did manage to send a final text message to a loved one. 2 words that would later surface publicly: emergency landing. Shortly after that message, the plane went down less than a mile from the runway and erupted into a massive fire. Since then, NTSB investigators have remained on scene, documenting wreckage, collecting evidence, and interviewing witnesses. And now, one of the most critical pieces of the investigation has been recovered: the cockpit voice recorder. When the NTSB confirmed that the cockpit voice recorder had been recovered, many assumed that answers would quickly follow. But aviation experts say that's not always how it works. The recorder can provide crew conversations, audible alarms, background engine sounds, and clues about cockpit workload. But what it cannot always explain is why a chain of events began in the first place. And that's where this case becomes more complicated, because investigators are still trying to determine who was actually flying the aircraft, what prompted the immediate return attempt, and whether the issue began with human decision-making or something mechanical. Greg Biffle himself was one of 3 people on board with a pilot's license. As of now, the NTSB has not publicly identified the pilot in command, and that uncertainty is fueling growing questions, especially among those who know this aircraft best. Here's where new information adds another layer. Federal investigators have confirmed that the Cessna Citation 550 involved in the crash was equipped with engines manufactured by Pratt & Whitney. The engines were produced in Canada by Pratt & Whitney Canada, while the company itself is headquartered in East Hartford, Connecticut. The NTSB says technical advisors from Pratt & Whitney are now assisting with the investigation. To be clear, no cause has been determined, and investigators have not said the engines were at fault. But the involvement alone has raised eyebrows, because in recent years, Pratt & Whitney engines have faced scrutiny across the aviation industry. In 2021, a United Airlines Boeing 777 experienced a right engine failure shortly after takeoff and was forced to return safely. In 2023, Pratt & Whitney disclosed a rare powder metal issue affecting certain engine components, a problem that led to billions in charges, increased inspections, and grounded aircraft across multiple fleets. Again, none of this means the Biffle crash was caused by engine failure. But it does mean investigators are looking closely, and so are veteran pilots. Mark Martin didn't just race alongside Greg Biffle, he knows this aircraft. In a public statement, Martin revealed that he has over 20 years as a citation pilot, more than 3,000 flight hours, extensive training through Flight Safety International, and according to Martin, the more details that emerge, the more unsettled he becomes. He described the crash as disturbing, not emotionally, but technically. Martin explained, that based on his experience with the Citation platform, certain performance characteristics simply don't line up with what's been publicly described so far. He didn't accuse anyone, he didn't claim a cause, and he didn't speculate recklessly. Instead, he raised a professional concern, the kind that comes from someone who has spent decades in both racing and aviation environments where margins are razor thin. When someone with that background says, "The more I learn, the more disturbing this becomes," people listen. And now, many are asking, what does Mark Martin see that hasn't been fully explained yet? Aviation investigations typically focus on three broad areas: human factors, mechanical systems, environmental conditions. Right now, all three remain on the table. Weather at the time was described as challenging, but not extreme. Pilot experience on board was substantial, and the aircraft had been flying for years without incident. Yet, something happened almost immediately after takeoff, severe enough to prompt a rapid return attempt. The fact that there was no emergency radio call. The fact that the plane stayed airborne for only minutes. And the fact that investigators still haven't identified the pilot in command. All of it suggests that the full story hasn't surfaced yet. And according to legal experts, if maintenance or undisclosed mechanical issues played a role, the implications could be significant, not just for this case, but for aviation safety more broadly. The NTSB says a preliminary report will be released within 30 days, but that report will only contain basic factual findings, not conclusions. A final report, including probable cause, could take 12 to 24 months. Until then, questions will remain. Questions about what triggered the emergency return, who was at the controls, and whether the black box will confirm or complicate what we think we know. What's clear is this. This wasn't just a tragic accident involving a public figure. It's a complex aviation case, one that seasoned pilots like Mark Martin are watching closely. And as more details emerge, this story may take turns that few expected. We'll continue following every confirmed update and separating facts from speculation as investigators work toward answers. And this is the part that's going to sit heavy with people, because when you strip away the headlines and you strip away the shock, what you're left with is a timeline that still doesn't feel fully explained. 10 minutes, that's what keeps echoing, 10 minutes in the air. And then, the aircraft is already trying to come back for an emergency landing. No confirmed emergency radio call. A passenger sends a text. Emergency landing. Which means something felt urgent enough that somebody believed they needed to warn someone on the ground. But there's still no clear public answer on what exactly went wrong in those moments. And I want to say this carefully because this matters. When the NTSB says everything remains under investigation, that's not just a standard line. That's the NTSB telling you, do not lock into one narrative yet. Because in aviation investigations, sometimes the first explanation people cling to ends up being the least accurate. Sometimes it's mechanical, sometimes it's human factors, sometimes it's weather, and sometimes it's a chain reaction. A small issue that becomes a bigger issue because of timing, altitude, decision pressure, and the margin for error being basically zero. That's why Mark Martin's reaction hits different. He isn't a random voice chasing attention. This is someone who knows how these jets behave, who knows what should be possible, who knows the performance, and who knows what doesn't add up feels like without even claiming a cause. And that's why fans are split right now. Some people hear that and go, it's a tragic accident. Let the investigators work. And other people hear that and go, hold up. If Mark Martin says the more he learns, the more disturbing it becomes. What is he picking up on that we're not being told yet? Now here's what I want to do. Because I don't want this channel to be the place that fuels rumors. I want this to be the place where we ask the right questions, based on confirmed information, and we stay patient until the evidence speaks. So let me ask you this. 1. What do you think the emergency landing text really signals? Not what you hope, not what you heard, but what it implies logically. Because that message could mean Something happened suddenly and fast. Someone on board felt the plane wasn't stable, or the crew realized they were not going to make it to destination and needed to get down immediately. But if that's the case, why no emergency radio call? And I'm not saying there should have been. I'm saying it's one of those details that makes you stop and think. 2. Do you think the black box clears things up or complicates them? Because when the cockpit voice recorder gets analyzed, it can reveal things most people never consider. Alarms, warnings, even a moment where someone says something that completely changes how you understand the timeline. But at the same time, sometimes the black box raises new questions. Were they troubleshooting something? Was there confusion about what they were seeing? Did something fail that they didn't have time to communicate? 3. And here's the biggest question. Why the return so quickly? 10 minutes is not a long flight that went wrong. That is something happening early, near the most critical part of flight where everything matters: altitude, speed, and options. So what event forces that kind of immediate return? Mechanical, environmental, human factors? The NTSB is going to dig into all of that. 4. And let's talk about the engines. Without jumping to conclusions, we now know Pratt & Whitney is assisting the investigation. That doesn't mean they cause anything, but it does mean investigators consider the engines important enough to examine deeply. And fans should understand that this is standard in high-profile, fatal aviation cases. But here's what I want you to consider. If the engines end up being cleared, then where does the investigation lean next? Maintenance, operational decisions, weather, a combination? Because I'm seeing people online locking into one explanation way too fast. And in aviation, when people lock in too early, they miss the truth. 5. Now I want to bring it back to Greg, because this can't just be a technical breakdown. Greg Biffle wasn't just a name on a headline. To NASCAR fans, he was a specific era, a specific style, tough, consistent, competitive, and respected. And now, this story has shifted into something way bigger than motorsports. It's about how fragile everything is. One day, you're planning the next chapter of life. And the next day, the world is reacting to a tragedy that still doesn't have answers. That's why this case is going to stay in the spotlight. Not because people are chasing drama, but because the questions are real, and because the people lost were real. So here's what I want you to do. Drop your thoughts in the comments, but do it like this. What's the one detail that stands out the most to you? Is it the 10-minute timeline, the emergency landing text, the lack of a radio call, Mark Martin's reaction, the engines being highlighted? And then answer this. Do you think the preliminary report will calm people down or make the debate louder? Because I'm telling you right now, the moment that preliminary report hits, the internet is going to run with it, whether it's complete or not. And I want us to be ahead of the noise. If you want me to keep covering this case with confirmed updates, hit subscribe. Because as soon as the NTSB drops the preliminary report, and as soon as more verified details come out, I'm going to break it down clearly, responsibly, and fast. And one last thing, if you're a pilot, aviation mechanic, air traffic controller, or someone who actually knows this aircraft, I want your perspective too. Not theories, not rumors, but insight. Because sometimes the most valuable comments come from the people who understand the technical side and can explain it in plain English. Rest in peace to Greg Biffle and everyone who lost their lives in this tragedy. And we'll be back the moment the next confirmed update drops.